In 1969, the late Benjamin Elijah Mays penned a book that has had far-reaching impact. The title of the book was Disturbed About Man. And in that book, Dr. Mays says that he is not disturbed about the devil, especially a devil who carries a pitchfork with horns protruding out of his head. He said, if that is real, it does not create fear in me. He said, but what I am disturbed about are the devils that wear tuxedos and evening gowns, and I might add police uniforms. He said, I'm disturbed about human beings' inhumanity to other human beings. When those of us witnessed the public execution of Eric Garner, something about that video gnawed at the very essence of what it means to be human. Something in that video caused deep groaning for those of us who are hopeful for what this country can be. For as we watched Officer Pantaleo choke and suffocate Eric Garner, something in those of us who have been sun-kissed are reminded of a long legacy that this country has with black bodies. There is something tragically familiar about black men and women being publicly executed in full display for the world to see. There is something historic in this country about the inconsistencies with regard to the treatment of black and brown bodies. Eric Garner was choked to death. 11 times he cried out, "I can't breathe," and Officer Pantaleo was unmoved by his cry, unmoved by his plea. Again, there's something strikingly familiar about people of color in this country whose cries go unheard, whose cries are unmet, and constantly find ourselves trying to validate our humanity in the midst of a context that continually seeks to dehumanize those of us who are inherently valuable. There is something strikingly familiar about that scene. I have to also say, and I won't be long, but I have to say that it was ironic that Eric Garner was the target by police because of the selling of what we know as Lucy's. In part, the reason why brothers and sisters sell Lucy's is because of the high tax rate on cigarettes. There's something very ironic about someone whose actions was trying to subvert what was viewed as high taxes. And in case you don't understand why it is familiar, 1773, this country was born by a subversive movement against high taxes. And so it is amazing how a country born in revolution and subversion against overpriced tea would now consider a criminal and kill a man who is trying to subvert overpriced cigarettes. There's something ironic that he would be choked to death. And the truth is that many people of color in this country have been choking for a long time. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those beautiful and eloquent words were choked by slavery. because there's something inconsistent when everyone except for brown bodies has a right to rights, except those of us, again, who have been kissed by the sun. When we saw that video of Officer Pantaleo choking Eric Garner, our souls cringed. How could another human being do that to another human being? And the only way you could feel comfortable choking the life out of another human being is if you don't view them as human. You see, I shared some time ago that when I was a child in the house, I saw roaches from time to time. And I would kill the roach. And I never asked the roach, could it breathe? Primarily because I did not view the roach as being valuable or having any validity in my context. And the only way you can take life from someone without being moved by the death is when you do not see them as having inherent humanity. And so, again, for those of us who cannot imagine taking the life of another human being, we create space between ourselves and Officer Pantaleo because in some ways he does not represent the best of humanity for us. We create space between ourselves and Officer Pantaleo because we can never fathom ourselves not honoring the dignity of another human being. We create space between ourselves and Officer Pantaleo because in so many ways we do not honor his view of human beings in being that there's a hierarchy of humanity and value. And so some lives have value and others have no value. And some lives are meaningful and others have no meaning. And we put space between ourselves and Officer Pantaleo. We only put space when we're afraid to look in the mirror. And why is that? Eric Garner did not necessarily die because of Officer Pantaleo's chokehold. I know it seems that way, and I know it appears that way in the video, but he died because for 7 minutes he lied on the sidewalk and people watched and did nothing. No CPR. No design to help him. No attempt to revive him. People, some who meant well, sat in the margins of death and watched a man die because they were unwilling to transcend the broken boundaries and barriers placed there by the police officers. And just in case you try to put space between yourself and Officer Pantaleo, then if you can't see yourself in him, see yourself in them who stood by and watched him die in 7 minutes. That is the real tragedy. Not that some insane man with a fragile ego and a wounded spirit was intoxicated by power because of a badge and a gun. That is not the tragedy. It is when people who wear tuxedos and evening gowns sit by and do nothing. That is the greater tragedy. We understand the crisis in our country around race, even though some of us are in denial about it. We understand the rabid inconsistencies with regard to whose lives have value, although some of us are in denial of it. But the truth of the matter is, all of us in here may be guilty of standing on the margins of death and watching countless people die every day. And 16 million children go hungry in this country, and you are unmoved by it. You're standing in the margins of death. When countless human beings do not have a place to lay their head in what might be the coldest day in New York City, you are standing in the margins of death. When children do not have adequate access and equitable access to educational resources and you say nothing, you are standing in the margins of death. When countless people yearn for the basic necessities of life so that they can survive and raise their children, and you say nothing because it has not come to your doorsteps, you are standing in the margins of death. When you stand on your box of self-righteousness and think that because you've never killed anybody that you're not guilty of murder, you are standing in the margins of death. Whenever you become so full of self-righteousness that you say, I could never suffocate a human being, maybe you ought to reimagine what a chokehold is and realize how maybe every day in some way you hold someone in the grip of your immunity to their pain. And that is the task. I long for a day when we can transcend our reckless egos. I long for a day when we stop being intoxicated by the aroma of our arrogance. I long for a day when all human beings have value. And the dying words of a man don't get commodified. I long for that day when all of us feel a little out of breath, as long as injustice still is prevalent. Where all of us feel a little out of breath, as long as mass incarceration is a reality in this country. Where all of us feel a little out of breath, as long as women are having a hard time being honored and dignified for their humanity. All of us ought to feel a little out of breath. And until that day comes, when the humanity of all people are taken with credibility and dignity, until that day comes, I will hold my breath.